The title of this video, about every scene having been done, comes from a quotation of Jack Nicholson's in Jan Harlan's excellent documentary about the director, Stanley Kubrick, A Life in Pictures. Like so much to do with The Shining, it's easy to gloss over and overlook the comment. However, by Nicholson's own admission, it refers to something that Stanley Kubrick used to say to him often, suggesting that it had more significance than a glib conversation piece. So given the evidence which has been pointed out in previous videos about scenes and dialogue which appear to borrow from earlier films, perhaps we should treat this statement literally. It certainly would be useful to do that for the purposes of this video, as you will see. Unlike previously illustrated quotations from other films, most of those featured in this video will be associated with movies dealing with mental instability and/or psychiatric themes. Just to expand on what I mean by that a little further, a film quoted here may primarily be associated with another genre, but have a subtext of mental instability rooted in it, something which would need psychiatric intervention. We've already seen an example of this. The threat facing Jack in the bathroom of room 237 came from within the shower, inverting the horror of Hitchcock's famous thriller Psycho. In Robert Bloch's original novel, Bates himself states that he may have been suffering from a mild form of schizophrenia. Later, his psychiatrist states that Bates was now a multiple personality. Norman, the little boy who needed his mother, Norma, the mother herself, and Normal, the adult who would go about daily existence. As an aside, this personality trio creates an interesting inversion to another film we've featured, Altman's Three Women, in which three characters with similar names, Millie, Mildred and Willie, appear to represent different psychological aspects of a single woman. Another example of a modified quotation we've already seen constituted the opening to The Shining. I speculated that this was an inversion of the beginning of another film with psychiatric subject matter. This, as you'll remember, was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which of course starred Jack Nicholson and Scatman Crothers. The scene in Foreman's film depicted a car en route to a psychiatric establishment where the majority of the rest of the film takes place. In fact, having watched a number of films set in institutions, highlighting the initial journey or the entry into the establishment in question appears to be a trope of the genre. Even in a film in which it's a subplot, the journey can appear significant. The above shots depict a deaf mute, the only real friend of the character John Singer being taken away to an institution. These shots are taken from The Heart is a Lonely Hunter and stand out somewhat because of the number of the bus and also the fact that the man is carrying a brown teddy bear, a reminder of the doctor scene with Danny. And if the choice of film seems random to you, I watched it because Kubrick himself specifically cited the name of Carson McCullers in the same list as he mentioned J.D. Salinger. But if the journey to the psychiatric institution constitutes one trope of the genre, then another seems to be the interview or discussion of some sort which takes place almost immediately after the arrival. Even in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it isn't long before we see R.P. McMurphy in an interview situation. But his circumstances were different to Jack Torrance's. He wasn't applying for a job. Fortunately for us, there is a film in which an actor we've already encountered does go for a job in a mental hospital. It even conforms to the trope of the initial journey, although his was on foot. But to better understand the significance of this film, let's look at the mundane sequence of actions that the leading man in The Shining takes after the journey to his destination is over. Firstly, he enters the building. Then, to get directions to the manager he needs to see, he addresses a woman who uses her finger to point out where he should go. On reaching the appropriate manager's office, he's invited in. There subsequently follow the standard courtesies of offering him a seat and a cup of coffee. In this new film, as we have seen, the leading man walks to the establishment rather than drives, whereupon he enters the building. To get directions to the manager he wishes to see, he addresses a woman who uses her finger, which is only just visible, to point out where he should go. On finding the manager in question, he's invited in and subsequently offered a seat and a cup of coffee. In other words, this film follows exactly the same pattern of opening lines and actions as The Shining. The film in question is called Lilith. Set in a mental institution, it starred Warren Beatty and Gene Seberg as the schizophrenic Lilith Arthur. There is at least one more indicator of a psychiatric theme in Ullman's office. I don't know who the first eagle-eyed person was who spotted the cigarette which disappears and reappears in Ullman's ashtray, but all credit to them. This, I believe, is very significant indeed. In fact, I think it's so important that it merits a presentation in its own right, so I won't go into this just now. It'll be the subject, the sole subject, of the next video. Now, as we've seen in previous videos, the interview in The Overlook also contains back references to other films and programmes of the main actors. These didn't necessarily have psychiatric themes, and I stand by my conjecture that they represented instances of shining from the past. Of course, the interview also takes place in Boulder, where we see Wendy in discussion with the doctor. Again, I drew a link between Wendy and Millie Lamoureux from the aforementioned Three Women. But another film may be relevant here too. In fact, why should it be an either-or situation? We're dealing with Stanley Kubrick after all. Anthony Page's 1977 film, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, starred Kathleen Quinlan as a young schizophrenic in a mental hospital. Leaving the interview aside, during a month later there is one of the most technically acclaimed scenes in the film. It starts when Jack is seen to be looking down at the model of the maze like a giant surveying his realm. The probable source of this particular shot is extremely intriguing, but is part of a subject we'll address in a later presentation. For now, we'll just focus on the technical shot in question. This is the famous composite shot of the maze model, which exposes more and more detail as the camera seems to descend right into it. It finally culminates in us seeing Wendy and Danny in the centre, before cutting to a relatively close-up shot of them. So what may have inspired this? In his groundbreaking 1948 film about institutional mental health care, The Snake Pit, Anatoly Litvak used a similar technique. However, as we should be used to by now, his technique was to start with a close-up of the human and gradually pull back to reveal the metaphorical pit of the title. Another similarity can be drawn from the months mentioned in a chat between the patient, Virginia Cunningham, and her psychiatrist, Dr. Kick. It strikes a real chord with a comment uttered by Shelley Duvall about being in ill health in making The Shining. Sam Fuller's 1963 budget masterpiece, Shock Corridor, had a very original angle to an asylum story. The protagonist is a journalist eager to win the Pulitzer Prize by revealing the culprit of a murder committed in the institution. The murder was witnessed by 3 insane inmates of the hospital, who he needs to cultivate whilst in moments of lucidity. To be convincing in the first place, the journalist needs to receive training from a psychiatrist so as to be able to feign schizophrenia. But in order to gain entry, he asks his girlfriend to pretend to be his sister and make a complaint to the police about him molesting her. Having successfully inveigled his way in, though, the name of one of the attendants would have made him feel very much at home in the Overlook. While there are a number of little things which may relate to The Shining in this film, the standout image for me was towards the end of it. And if you're wondering why Kubrick may have selected this seemingly random image, think back to my suggestion that there could be more than one source for any given scene, and bear it in mind while watching the next video. What was used as a pretext in Shock Corridor is a significant part of the plot in Bunny Lake is missing. This film just so happens to co-star the man who became Kubrick's lead in 2001: A Space Odyssey, Keir Dullea. The film revolves around a 4-year-old girl, the eponymous Bunny Lake, who goes missing from school on her very first day. The mother Anne refers to the establishment as a madhouse. When Stephen Lake arrives, we learn that he is not the father as we originally expected, but Anne's brother. But as we come to learn during the film, he has an extremely unhealthy affection for his sister. And there are numerous elements in this film which appear to coincide with The Shining, including forbidden rooms, imaginary friends, and neck injuries. And last but by no means least, the little 4-year-old bunny being secreted in a space under a counter, whereas the relatively older Danny was able to make the same decision for himself. Nor was this the first film involving mental issues that the coldly rational astronaut of 2001: A Space Odyssey had appeared in. Even though the twins' famous phrase was drawn from King's original novel, it is striking that it is the play Whitney scene in David and Lisa which sparks the friendship between the two eponymous characters. This next movie ticks all the boxes in terms of its mental and institutional relevance. The question marks around it are the timing. Filming on The Shining had already started when the film version of Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar went into production in June 1978. It starred Anne Jackson as a psychiatrist. Nonetheless, there are just so many similarities between it and The Shining. The institution scenes were filmed at the Four Winds Hospital in Katona, New York, so it's not inconceivable that images of its interior could be obtained. And there certainly seem to be similarities in terms of its old-fashioned floral decor to the area around the Torrance's quarters. Then there's a noticeable similarity of a door-knocking scene, and an interesting possible composite of two of Danny's scenes. The bell jar does not fit the bill of the others in one key respect. It wasn't very good. All the others have been critically acclaimed. But then, if it was being made at the same time as The Shining, Kubrick could hardly have known the end result until it was too late to change his film. So are there any other critically acclaimed films concerning mental imbalance which may be of consequence? Well, in the previous video I mentioned a blue adult toweling robe being worn by a young boy in an episode of The Incredible Hulk. If it had a future, maybe it had a past. I've not got into the possible relevance of John Cassavetes to The Shining before, but a scene in one of his films may have provided a source for that important prop. At the moment when Gina Rowland's character is about to be committed in A Woman Under the Influence, her husband, played by Peter Falk, appears in a blue toweling robe. I've previously cited two possible inspirations for the old lady in the bath. The well-known one is Clouseau's Les Diaboliques. Less well-known is the corpse in the bath in Polanski's Repulsion. But to my knowledge, a hitherto unacknowledged possibility is the character Albert from Fred Wiseman's acclaimed documentary expose of a mental health institution, Titicut Follies. Now, it's possible that they may all be relevant, as I've previously argued, but it is only the figure in Les Diaboliques which actually rises from the bath like the old woman in The Shining. Last but not least, even Mason appears to have a very subtle reference to mental health. I discussed how this program was relevant to The Shining in a previous video. The most striking physical feature was the almost identical hairstyle that Mason and Danny shared. The tune which closed the program emphasized his precocious intelligence. It went by the name Mason Knows. Its content informed us that as well as knowing what pterodactyls and hieroglyphics are, Mason knows what a schizophrenic is. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, I would like to think that in combination with the Shining in The Shining videos, there is now more than circumstantial evidence of Kubrick incorporating images from past films, TV programs, and works of art into The Shining. It's as if the Overlook is actually haunted by the ghosts of these films I've mentioned, that they are deliberately there to fill out a backstory. Subtle references back to the actors' previous work may reinforce their presence in the hotel. But what about all those films with psychiatric themes, many of which were set in hospitals and cited schizophrenia? Could schizophrenia explain the changes in characters we discussed, such as Eugene O'Neill and Jane Gallagher? Is the Overlook a metaphor for a hospital? Famously, Kubrick edited out the last few minutes of the film, which was set in a hospital. Was it a psychiatric hospital? What might be the implications if we take into account the conclusion of the video on psychology in The Shining? Furthermore, might there be implications for the Torrances' relationship, as suggested by Shock Corridor and Bunny Lake is Missing? The mind boggles. Throughout this series of videos, I've suggested a more humorous side to the film, although it could well be black humour. Certainly, if Kubrick has incorporated a game of spot the source film in it, it suggests a strong element of fun and games. But I haven't finished yet with the psychiatric theme. We need to find out about that cigarette and see just how that reinforces the argument. So thank you for viewing this presentation. I hope the content was of interest, even if the production values left something to be desired. I'm afraid I'm not too gifted in that area. Also, please remember that this is just one small facet of the puzzle that is The Shining. To learn more, you'll need to follow the breadcrumbs, as it were, and view further presentations. So if you're interested in doing that, please remember to like, subscribe and share this one. Thank you.